bigoted woman.
Me and my friends sort of used to run through the fields of wheat.
You turn if you want to. The ladies, not for turning.
It will cost.
I know words, I have the best words, but there's no better word than stupid.
Now, with an exquisite sense of timing, Downtown's managing director and chair of the Downtown Den podcast is not here. Whilst Rishi Sunak was getting drenched in Downing Street announcing the general election, our Frank was getting ready to slap on the sun cream in Florida. So, in the absence of Florida Frank, it's left to me and Joe Phillips to comment on the opening of the campaign and ask why the Prime Minister did it. And breaking news today is that Jeremy Corbyn is going to stand as an independent, and John Redwood standing down, the former guy who challenged John Major, standing down in his constituency in the face of a big Liberal Democrat threat. We'll come to all that. So we're right up to date here. And just to remind you that Joe is a former advisor to Lib Dem leader Paddy Ashdown, and the brilliant title of a Downtown blog this week is Things Can Only Get Wetter. A reference both to the shambolic launch of the campaign in Downing Street and the music that was playing in the background. Joe, good morning to you.
Good morning, Jim. It's been a rather busy week. Fancy Frank going away and leaving us to take over.
Oh, we mustn't gloat about that. But he was rather unkind about my trip to see the eclipse in Texas, so I'm only getting my own back.
Yeah, but you timed it when there wasn't anything happening.
Yeah, I mean, I want to get on to the substantive issues, but and we can exaggerate this, but let's just have a word about the look in Downing Street with the rain falling and the music. And I mention this because, as you and I well know, there are photo clips which are quite important in the history of politics. I think of two: Neil Kinnock falling on the beach in Brighton and getting caught by a wave, which became a sort of iconic moment. And then, of course, Ed Miliband eating an egg sandwich. Now, we can all say these things are trivial and we've got to get on to the matters of substance, but why send him out in the drenching rain?
Well, absolutely. And there's Keir Starmer, who was pretty boring this morning on the radio doing the broadcast round. But the one line he did have is, how can you stand there saying, I'm a man with a plan in the rain without an umbrella? I mean, you know, you and I know, Jim, there are advisors and media managers. In fact, that's what I used to do, and spin doctors. And you spend your life trying to make sure that your party leader isn't underneath a sign that says exit, or, you know, something like that, or something where you can cut the ends off where they're doing tankers or something like that, you know. So I can't for the life of me think what possessed him to not take an umbrella or at least put a mac on, because he looked like a wet seal. I mean, he looked like a sort of an extra for a rather bad Amdram edition of Happy Days with the Fonz, because his suit almost was like a leather jacket. And I don't understand what he was thinking. I mean, there wasn't much they could do about the blaring of Things Can Only Get Better, which was obviously.
Well, you say that. I want to take that up immediately. I've had various texts from various people saying the man should have been arrested. Now, as a good Liberal, that would not go down well with you, but that man can be a real pain when you're trying to broadcast.
Yeah, well, you probably remember doing the conference circuit, Jim. There used to be a bloke, I think he's dead now, and I think his name was Stuart, and he used to stand behind anybody doing an interview with a billboard thing, and it was anti-smoking. And in fact, Ian Dale, the broadcaster, ended up in a tussle and tumbling down the steps at Scarborough or somewhere or other. So, you know, people have always gate crashed and pushed in on photographs and photo ops and interviews. I mean, that was incredibly loud, and you could say it was a public nuisance, but it was only for a few minutes. And, you know, what are the police supposed to do? You go and say, turn it down. It then becomes a bigger issue.
Yes, I mean, they spent £1 million on a conference room in Downing Street. I mean, is there an issue about it can only be used for state, you know, when is his prime minister and not as a political leader? Was that the sensitivity there?
I don't know. I mean, you know, we've only ever seen that conference suite used once when Allegra Stratton was sniggering and then shortly decided to resign with the only decency that anyone's ever shown in Downing Street. But yes, I mean, you could have said, on account of the weather, we will do it inside. I mean, I'm sure the camera crews and the press teams would have been delighted to not stand in the rain.
Or somebody could have come out and stood beside him with an umbrella.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
that's not the end of the world, for heaven's sake. Anyway, there we are. But anyway, let's move on to the substantive issue, which is this decision to go now. I mean, you will have obviously followed various conservative websites like Conservative Home, where MPs are absolutely furious about this. And, there was even this rumor that they were going to try and no confidence him to stop him going to talk to the king and all this sort of stuff. So I think that's been slightly underreported.
Yes, I mean, the idea that you would have a no confidence vote in a prime minister on the day that Parliament's about to be dissolved, you sort of think, is there anybody in the Conservative Party with a working brain cell? Because this is just ridiculous. They want to take the fight to the very end, don't they? And prove that they are unelectable. I mean, I think, maybe not the last podcast, but a couple of podcasts ago with you and Frank, that I thought it would be the summer, for a variety of reasons. One of which is, I think, the channel crossings during the presumably better weather over the summer is going to be a problem. And I think, although the figures on paper point to inflation coming down, people aren't feeling any better off. And the real thing is that nothing has changed in the polling significantly in the last year. There's nothing that, the lead between Labour and the Tories has gone up and down by a couple of points, but the Tory figures have actually stayed fairly static for a year. And I don't know why Tory MPs are surprised. I think the other thing is, and Alistair Campbell said this the other day on a broadcast, I think Rishi Sunak's just given up, actually. And I think they've run out of steam as a party. There's 73 now with John Redwood announced that they're standing down at the next election. Even if they carried on until January, which is the last possible date they could have had an election, they're not going to get anything substantial done.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a stretch to say he's given up and is just trying to sort of throw the towel in. I mean, let me just push back on you for a moment. We had those inflation figures which are coming down, but I don't think that should be a trigger for the election. Today we've heard about quite a reduction in people's energy prices. But the point is, Joe, that these things take time to work into people's pockets until people realise that they've got more spending power. And surely that was an argument to go long at least until November.
Well, that is one argument. But then, you then get into the winter if you're looking at a October, November, and OK, the energy prices have come down, but they've only come down to what they were before the war in Ukraine and when they absolutely rocketed. So people are still paying those bills. People are still paying increased council tax, increased house insurance, increased rail and bus fares. All of those things have gone up and people don't feel better off because of the price of goods in supermarkets as much as anything. I mean, pretty basic things are really, really expensive. And that's hard for people. And if that is your constant worry, if you've got a family to feed and you're juggling jobs and you're trying to keep the car going and pay for commuting and everything else, it doesn't matter what the politicians say, oh, inflation's coming down. And you are right, Jim, that yes, it might have been, but the Bank of England earlier this week didn't indicate that there was an interest rate cut in the offing, which I think might have been a reason for a trigger. And the other thing, I mean, you might have more insight into this than me, that before the election was announced, there were rumours swirling that Jeremy Hunt was going to be reshuffled. Now, I mean, that would have seemed a bonkers thing to do, but then nothing would surprise either of us, I'm sure. But, they could have, I suppose, waited until an autumn statement with better economic figures. But I think there's too many things. And there's Rwanda, of course.
Well, in terms of the autumn giveaway budget, I think what's knocked that out partly is these huge expenditures that are quite rightly going to have to be made to the post office workers and the post office people, and also obviously the blood scandal. I mean, these are such substantial amounts that they do actually impinge on the national budget. I mean, I suppose, Joe, there was a sense that frustration, why won't he go to the country, that would have continued to build up. But I still think I'm still very, very surprised that it happened. And my surprise was deepened when he revealed quite casually there will be no Rwanda flights before July the 4th.
Yeah, I know. I mean, it was sort of like, oh, well, no, a bit like all the other things that have fallen by the wayside that he was so committed to. But Rwanda has been the defining business of this parliament and has cost the country so much money. And Rwanda has shed loads of money. It's cost a lot to go through the court. There are Home Office officials in Rwanda, presumably sitting there twiddling their thumbs, waiting for flights that might never arrive. Labour have said they'll scrap it if they get into office. And you sort of think, so did you not really care about that? Why did you pin everything on that? And now you're sort of throwing it away so lightly. It's weird.
But why are no flights going to take off for Rwanda until after July the 4th? What's the continuing delay? I thought that as soon as the legislation was passed, they had a list of 350 people and they'd been notified of their deportation. I don't understand what the problem is.
No, I don't. Except I presume there are legal challenges for individuals if those people have been identified to go, that there may be sort of legal cases pending. But I mean, if you talk about legal cases, the report out today, I think from the National Audit Office, about the delays to justice. I mean, years and years for really serious crimes like child abuse and sexual assaults and things.
Well, he has 25 judges standing by to hold special courts for this.
I know. And anyway, we don't need to send people to prison because it's all overcrowded. So actually, why bother with the courts? Let's just, natural justice prevail. It's just ridiculous.
I'm just really surprised because he's put so much emphasis on Rwanda, knowing that the decision to go for this snap election would prevent him sending any flights off. I think is staggering. I mean, because we're now in a situation where he has to say, but we are on track and we will do it, without the proof. I mean, maybe he was worried that actually the first flight, something might go wrong and the flight might be held up on the runway whilst the Strasbourg court. Maybe it's that, but I do find that particularly astonishing.
Well, yes, because it was his sort of, the linchpin of his defining policies, if you like. I mean, I suppose the only other way to look at it rather cynically is to say, well, it won't happen. And if the Labour Party get in and form the next government, the Tories will forever say, well, we had a plan and Labour stopped it, which of course needs to be rebutted in full very quickly, because it was Sunak's choice to call the election when he did. I mean, he could have gone, he didn't have to go on July the 4th. He could have gone a little bit later in July.
I want to look at the individual parties' prospects and the developments shortly, but I'd like to turn to your blog, if I may, because you've addressed what's going to be coming up in the campaign itself with some very interesting observations. You say in your blog it's going to be a brutal campaign. What have you got in mind?
I think the social media attacks, I mean, we saw it a little bit during the Tory leadership campaign, and we saw the jostling maybe from Kemi Badenoch's side, who knows, that basically did for Penny Mordaunt by bringing up the whole issue of transgender identity and trans rights. And I think what we're going to see is a brutal attack from both sides, actually. But I think particularly from the Tories on the Labour Party, they'll keep going on about Starmer having served in Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet. They'll talk about his perceived failings when he was Director of Public Prosecutions. They'll bang on about Angela Rayner's property portfolio of having, one house. And I think, the same will be true the other side. But you see, the trouble is, Jim, as you and I know, this absolutely turns people off. They will just switch off in droves. But it's those little things that will stick. I mean, we've already seen within 24 hours of the election being called, Sunak on the stump somewhere or other in a warehouse, I think. And it turned out that he wasn't actually meeting real local people. They were Tory councillors. Now, it doesn't need the people like you and me as much as it used to, because there's always going to be somebody there who's going to take the inadvertent photo that can't be managed. We remember Gordon Brown still on microphone talking about that bigoted woman after he'd done a phone-in program. So I think, the public know that there's an appetite for this, and certain sections of the media will be more than happy to lap it up. And what happens is that it actually detracts from the real issues, the real policies, the real serious stuff, because somebody has to stand there defending what they said, saying it was taken out of context. And I think therefore it becomes a very disjointed and discombobulated campaign. And this is going to sound like I'm completely bonkers, which I, as you know, I'm not. But it has been said, and it has been raised by, MI5 and former MI5 bosses and security experts. Do not underestimate the disruption and disinformation that can be fed into our own social media feeds from other people, other states, people for whom it is in their interest for us to have a divided society.
Well, on the subject of fake news, I cling to the hope. I mean, it all took us by surprise, I think, particularly in 2016 with the American elections and with the Brexit referendum campaign. But do you think people are, perhaps in a bad way, inured to this now and are going to be highly suspicious of anything really sensational that's cooked up by the Russians or even by bad actors in this country? Is there any hope of that?
I think they're probably suspicious of something highly sensational, but I think you can see, the sort of the manufactured fury, the whipped up Twitter storm of 5 people getting angry because there's no parking space outside their house. But, whether it's directed at the BBC for their stance on Gaza, or Gary Lineker's comments on whatever's happening in the world outside football, I think it's very easy to see how these things take on a life of their own. And it's not like the old days where you say, no, actually, that's not true. I can point to my honourable friend to this XYZ and here are the figures, because it's so fast and furious. It's like a pub fight. Nobody's listening, everybody's talking over each other, and everybody thinks they know the truth because they were there, or they know somebody who saw it or heard something.
I think veterans, seniors like you and I, are going to need to bear in mind that this campaign is going to be very different even from the last one in terms of the way in which it's conducted, because we are fans of the public meeting and the leaflets and all the traditional stuff. But as I understand it, the parties are spending millions on individual targeting of voters and individual finessing of the campaign in particular constituencies, which isn't easy for national broadcasters and newspapers particularly to pick up. I think that's a very interesting point.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think it makes it very hard for journalists, particularly broadcast journalists, who are governed by very, very strict rules on balance during an election period, which is called purdah. So, newspapers can get away with an awful lot more, and have always been able to, because they don't have the same restrictions on them. I think for broadcasters, it is much harder. And I think it will be very interesting to see whether the parties are targeting local news outlets, be they local papers, local radio, local free sheets, websites, that sort of thing. Because I think, one of the things that over the last couple of years, probably the last 5 years, is that politics has become so much noise that people switch off. And I think, as you tend to switch off, and as some things seem to be absolutely insurmountable, whether it's Putin's invasion of Ukraine, or the war in Gaza, or climate change, people become much more insular. So the local issues become really, really important. And I think that that's where, if the parties are smart and clever, they've got the boots on the ground, if you like, to feed in that intelligence and say, people here are really concerned about a new housing estate, or the closure of this doctor's surgery, or the building of a new school, that you can really tailor a campaign. And the Americans have done it quite well. They did it very well for Obama's campaign. That was the first time that it was really using social media to go to those different people. And I think one of the key groups, people like you and I are always going to go out and vote, Jim. And if we're too old to get to the polling station, we'll do a postal vote because we think it's a duty. But for young people, and I don't necessarily mean 18-year-olds, but people under 30, let's say, it's something that's not important, even though they'll have an opinion on climate change or, you know, the environment or whatever it is. And there are other groups of people, you know, particularly Black and ethnic minority, younger people and younger men in particular, who just, it's not on their radar. So if you can target those through different outlets, then that's good, because the more people who get involved, the better it is for democracy.
Well, Mariana Spring, who's the sort of disinformation correspondent for the BBC, I've been following her on the Americast thing, where she's had she creates these, in a good way, there's nothing sinister about this, she creates these fake voters so that she can find out, you know, so one's a right-wing conservative, one's a moderate conservative, one's a social democrat, one's a Marxist or whatever, and she does that in America with the, you know, Make America Great Again, moderate Republicans, moderate Democrats and left-wing Democrats, and as a result of setting up those sites, she receives the sort of stuff that they're targeting those particular groups, and she's going to do that with the British electorate. So yeah, we'll find out a bit about what the parties are doing when they're targeting particular individuals. Can I just were you with Paddy in 2010 during the general election campaign?
No.
Did you ever do a general election campaign with Paddy?
Well, 92.
92. I just want to ask you, because this is the next thing I want to get on to, the actual pace of an election, when you're actually with a party leader, and it's every day, every night, it's 6 weeks we've got facing this now. Just give us a flavour of what it's like in the actual heat of a general election campaign, as opposed to the slightly more relaxed non-general election campaign period.
Well, it's absolutely exhausting. And, you know, I'm talking an awfully long time ago, although I've done many by-elections and other election campaigns, not working for a political party since then. But, you know, we've now got non-stop social media, as we were just talking about. Your phones are going, you know, back in the day, Paddy was a bit of a pioneer. You know, we had pagers, and he had a mobile phone that was the size of a house brick and some peculiar sort of handheld computer that he kept talking about as being, you know, the white heat of technology. And I thought, look, this looks more like the dying ember of something else. But, you know, it's so different and it's so instant, and the demands on broadcasters, journalists, commentators like us, you know, they want you now. They want to know what you think is going to happen in 5 minutes. They want you to be there to see what's happened and then be back to tell them what's happened. So it's relentless. And I think the management of a leader's tour, you know, you'll have the basics in it. You'll know where the key points are, the key locations are, whether they're target seats or whether they're, I don't know, for instance, Jeremy Hunt's constituency for the Lib Dems or John Redwood's, and we'll come on to him in a minute. So you know all of those things are sort of given. But you're traveling, you know, and you're on a battle bus, because if you get on a helicopter, you're going to be lambasted. If you fly.
Oh, I flew with Paddy from Knutsford to Chester once.
Yeah, very lucky he didn't try and fly the plane himself, because he always like to have a go on it. Yeah. There are all those sort of things to take into account, and whilst you're doing one thing, something else will have happened. So, you know, you might have been talking to the party faithful in a lovely jolly market town somewhere in Shrewsbury, and your phones have been off, and all of a sudden you've got a message saying, oh, somebody's just said this, whether it's one of your opposition people or whether it's somebody in your own party who's made a terrible gaffe. And you just don't have enough hands, enough brain space. And it's absolutely exhausting. I mean, anybody who's a political journalist can say goodbye to any family engagements, holidays or anything for the next 6 weeks.
Yes, well, we had a little gaffe from the Prime Minister yesterday. He was in Wales saying, are you looking forward to the Euros? And of course, painfully, Wales were eliminated from the Euros. So yeah, that was gaffe number one. But I mean, there is some doubt as to whether Keir Starmer, how's with his personality, you know, he's obviously conducting this Ming Vars strategy. But personality wise, he doesn't strike me as the sort of person who's going to find it easy to be flexible on the road.
No, I think he's probably like Gordon Brown, who in the flesh and with real people is much more engaging, much more empathetic, much more human. And he certainly looks more comfortable with real people. He is very, very guarded, and he has been so careful to choreograph the Labour Party to where it is today, as opposed to where it was 4 years ago under Corbyn. And there is that danger that, you know, if you call it a danger, that when he's unleashed, if you like, his minders can't stop him saying something. I mean, he's stumbled this morning on a couple of questions around tuition fees and the two-child benefit cap, but he was very clear on Gaza. But he struggled with an answer about Diane Abbott compared to Natalie Elphicke, you know. So there are issues, and people, strategists, manipulators, spin doctors, call them what you like, will be listening and watching and thinking, there's a weak point, keep going on that one, you know, forget what you're doing on green energy, keep going on the Diane Abbott, Natalie Elphicke thing. And so everything becomes diluted, and it's very, very hard to keep control of the agenda. I mean, you know, Alistair Campbell, obviously, who was Blair's chief communications guru, and he was dead right. You know, the first rule is rebut and then move on to your story. You know, you've got to take control of the agenda, and you've got to stick to that agenda, and you've got to be able to say, yeah, well, somebody's dealing with the Diane Abbott thing, and I understand why people are upset about Natalie Elphicke, but let us get back to what matters to ordinary people. You know, you've got to keep coming back to the people you're talking to, which is the voters.
Let's turn to the party prospects. Have the concern, I mean, I think you would acknowledge that it is generally true that opinion polls narrow during a general election campaign. On that basis, have the Conservatives got any prospects of either victory or else forcing a hung parliament?
I would be absolutely staggered if they had victory, but I do think it is quite possible that they won't do as badly as the polls right now and for the last 6 months have been predicting. I think, as I've said before, you know, this is Labour's election to lose. Nobody's out there in love with Keir Starmer. A lot of people have had it up to the back teeth with 14 years of Tory chaos and bad government and bad decisions and an awful lot of money gone into the pockets of their mates and cronies, and, you know, the failure of public services. And I don't think people are daft enough or naive enough to think that Keir Starmer or Ed Davey or, you know, the Dalai Lama could change things overnight. All of these things take time, and it's just a question of how much, you know, you haven't got very long. People will put their trust in you, but they will expect to see something quite quickly. The other thing that I would say about the Tories is they've got a lot of people standing down. Now, in some constituencies, they will have already got successor candidates in place who will have been working hard in the constituency, making themselves known, getting involved in local issues, working with local councils, etc. In other places where those people stepping down has been more recent, there will be an unknown person who's coming in, where there might have been a Labour or Lib Dem or Green candidate in place who's been working their socks off. So
well, it's worse than that, Joe. As I understand it, because of this precipitous calling of the election, there are quite a few Conservative. I think even the chairman of the party hasn't. In Northwest Durham has been abolished, and I don't think he's been formally selected for anywhere else. And I'm not sure. You know, we were talking the other day about whether Street would go for Solihull for the Conservatives. I don't think that's been filled. I think there's a real problem because of this hasty calling the election and presumably minimal contact with Conservative Central Office, where they've got to sort these things out, that the Conservative Party this weekend are going to have to rush to select candidates. So it really emphasises the point that you're making. Not only are they unknown, but they're not even selected as we speak.
Yeah. Well, and also, I mean, again, it sort of it casts another big question mark over Rishi Sunak's decision making. He hasn't clearly talked to central office. He clearly hasn't talked to his MPs or the 1922 committee. None of those things he has to do, but you would think, wouldn't you, that if you are going into battle, you might at least warn your army that that's what's likely to happen, not suddenly, oh, blimey, cancel your summer holiday and off you go.
Turning to the Labour Party, I mean, the huge tension is going to be this, and you've obviously referred to the Keir Starmer's interview most recently, this ultra careful approach that he's taking, trying to balance not giving the Conservatives any room to attack them on recklessness. But, you know, the other side of that is that it seems to be uninspiring. I mean, in your blog, you refer to the danger of apathy in this election. Are Labour, you know, going to sustain this lead on the basis, as you say, that people have just want to change? Is that going to be enough, or are people going to get a bit irritated by the limited ambition of Labour's campaign?
I think people who are not committed Labour voters will actually get quite frustrated. And I think a lot of people who are, you know, who are furious with the Conservatives for reasons that we've often spoken about, they need to see the same anger and the same passion from the Labour Party. Now, it doesn't have to be Keir Starmer. You know, it can be Angela Rayner, it can be Yvette Cooper, it can be David Lammy, it can be Rachel Reeves. Now, Rachel Reeves is, in my opinion, doing a very fine job of looking like and sounding like and is a woman who knows what she's talking about. You know, she's got a lot of confidence from the business sector. She's got a lot of backing from, you know, senior people, including the former governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney. So, you know, she's been ploughing that furrow and doing it very well. And of course, she is a recognised former Bank of England economist in her own right. I think the problem is going to come when you talk about things like, oh, we're going to cut waiting lists by making hospitals work more weekends and evening shifts and things, and we're going to find the money. The money is one problem. How do you pay for it? The public, to a certain extent, I think, don't actually care. What they want is to have stuff that works. And it, you know, you can juggle around with the figures from non-DOMs and VAT on private schools and all of that stuff. Yes, it makes sense to make hospitals work longer hours. You've got to get the staff to do that. Are you going to have a battle with the unions, or are you going to end up bringing in agency staff, which is going to cost much more money? How much further are you prepared to go on technology? Tony Blair got it fundamentally, catastrophically wrong, trying to do an IT system that worked for the NHS. What Keir Starmer needs to do is to carry on being, you know, calm, boring, dull and sensible, the Clem Attlee, if you like, to our Poundland Churchill, Boris Johnson, and actually talk about rebuilding Britain, making things better. And he has been quite good to say, I can't do everything overnight. But he's got to somehow or other empathise with this feeling of utter fury that, you know, the rivers and seas are full of shit. The trains are expensive and unreliable, that people can't afford to get to work. They can't afford to rent a home. They can't afford to buy a home. He's got to get angry. And we've, you know, you see it to a certain extent. And I know I talked about Gordon Brown earlier, but you see it and you hear it and you read it from Gordon Brown, that real hardcore fury at children in this country living in poverty in 2024. What I want to see from Keir Starmer is that fury that so much has gone so badly wrong.
Well, you mentioned Clement Attlee, and you will also recall when the last time that we had a July general election, which was in 1945, where Labour had arguably their best victory. Just on the Jeremy Corbyn thing, do you think he's going to hold Islington as an independent?
It depends who the Labour candidate is, because it's going to be a very tough fight for them. And I'm not sure that I know who the Labour candidate is, but I'm sure they've got somebody in place.
How much of a distraction will it all be? I mean, you know, it gives the Conservative press another thing to gnaw away at. Oh, look, Jeremy's down in London campaigning. You know,
and they can keep pointing quite accurately to the fact that Keir Starmer, you know, served in his shadow cabinet and said, you know, he was proud to, he called him a friend. So, you know, that is going to be another stick with which they can beat Keir Starmer and the Labour Party and say, has the Labour Party really changed?
Now, the next party we have to deal with in terms of the English opinion polls, Joe, and painful as this may be, is not the Lib Dems, but Reform, who are ahead of the Lib Dems in the opinion polls. And the huge news there is that Nigel Farage is not going to stand as a candidate. It was very interesting what he said. He said he'd been knocked sideways by this precipitous announcement, and that what I read into it was that he thought he would need a lot longer to nurse a constituency, and he's been knocked sideways. Now, you can believe that or not, or you can believe his attractive salary on GB News, and apparently his wish to take part in the American election on behalf of Trump have been factors. But, you know, how much of a blow to Reform is the fact that he's not fighting a seat or taking the leadership?
Well, he said he'll campaign for them. I mean, don't forget Nigel Farage, despite all his headline making and the huge influence and impact he's had on British politics over the last 15, 20 years or so. He has failed 14 times to be elected. He was only ever elected, ironically, to the European Parliament, which he loathed so much, but I think still takes a pension from them. So they don't have that figurehead, and it may be that, and I don't know where GB News will sit, because my understanding is that as the president of Reform, he would have to come off air.
I think he is, yes,
during the election period. Well, that removes his sort of mouthpiece, but you know, he will create publicity. I think he sees, you know, a future under Trump, God knows doing what. But I think he quite enjoys this thing of, I don't have to be elected, I can just be a disruptor. I can bring down, you know, a very senior woman in the banking industry. I can make the Tories go further to the right so that they become completely unelectable. Reform say they've got 500 candidates in place. I'd love to know how much vetting they've done on those, because actually both Labour and the Tories and the Liberal Democrats and the Greens have got every opportunity to go, you know what, these people are completely raving lunatics. You know, you can't vote for them. Let's go for Count Binface instead. I think they will eat into the Tory vote in some areas, and that's good for Labour and the Lib Dems. And they will, of course, because of electoral rules, they will get more publicity. So they will be getting, you know, they'll get more coverage, but they will also be held to account on issues that they're, as far as I know, they don't have any policies on.
As far as I understand it, the Liberal Democrats are only seriously campaigning in 80 seats. Is that wise strategic acknowledgement of their weakened position in British politics, or a sad commentary on where we've come from a party that was in government as recently as 2015?
I think it's a bit of both, Jim. I mean, I think, you know, in terms of strategy and using your resources, there is absolutely no point in going out and fighting and campaigning in places where you don't have a chance of winning. I mean, you know, back in the day when Chris Renard, Lord Renard as he is now, was running our election campaign strategy, you know, we used to put out these focus leaflets. It's a two-horse race, only the Lib Dems can win here. And, you know, even I, as press secretary to Paddy Ashton, would think, I'm not sure that's strictly true, Chris, you know, with a 27,000 Labour majority in the Rhondda Valley or something like that. But I think it makes sense. You know, they've done quite well in the local elections. They're beginning to rebuild that local base. They're good at local government. The Lib Dems do well when they put the hard work in. They don't do well when they reach above. And they, you know, they have got to get some more MPs into Parliament, which I think they will do. You will then get a different calibre, you'll get a different voice. You know, a lot rests on Ed Davey and Layla Moran and Wendy Chamberlain, but, you know, they're not well known. They don't even get a question at Prime Minister's Question Time because the SNP is the second largest opposition party. So, you know, in some ways, Lib Dems always benefit for election campaigns in the same way as Reform Party will do, because there is the element of balance. So they have to get more coverage. Now, if they can sharpen their message, sharpen their act, say what they're doing locally, they've got every chance of taking some of those Tory scalps like possibly
Well,
Jeremy Hunt, Dominic
yeah.
Raab and
Well,
John Redwood.
Well, John Redwood, that scalp has already been achieved. I mean, obviously he's entitled, I absolutely understand this. At the moment an election's called, it can concentrate the mind of MPs who've been dithering about whether to go or not. And Sir John Redwood may well be in that category. The fact of the matter is that the Lib Dems are only 7,000 votes behind him. And as you illustrated, there are a number of other of those sort of West London seats where the Lib Dems are doing well. I mean, do you think he's pretty sure that he was going to be defeated?
I think so. I think it's probably partly that. I think it's probably partly, I mean, he's been an MP since 1983, I think, for Wokingham, and I think it's probably frustrating.
And for people who are much younger than us, challenged John Major. John Major dramatically stood down as Prime Minister and said, "Put up or shut up." Well, yes. Redwood, unlike others, did put up and lost to him. So he's not a minor figure for people who perhaps are a bit younger and don't know who he is.
No, and he has been, he was one of John Major's bastards, wasn't he? And he has been a constant thorn in the side of every Tory leader since John Major about Europe. He's not a stupid man. He's done very well, I think, as a constituency MP. He's had various ministerial posts. But you'd sort of think, if you sort of reached the end of the line and maybe wanted to do something else, wouldn't you have announced that you were standing down a little bit earlier than the day after the election was called? Because it just looks a little bit desperate. Yes.
Okay, well, it's absolutely fascinating, and I'm very grateful to you, Joe, for all your insights. I mean, the fact that you've worked alongside a party leader is invaluable in getting a feel for what we're about to undertake. So that's all from Joe and me. We hope that Florida Frank will be back on duty fairly soon, and that you will continue to tune into our Downtown Dens. You can be absolutely sure that Downtown will be right across this election, looking at it from both a political and a business point of view. But for now, from me and Joe, good morning.